Muted.
Good morning and welcome to the CRI webinar for June the 2nd, 2016. I'm Bruce Reardon. I'm the program director at CRI. We are based at UC Berkeley. We bring academics and climate practitioners together for research projects, workshops, and webinars all around advancing action on Bay Area climate adaptation and resilience. You can find more information about us on the web at www.climatereadinessinstitute.org. We're very pleased today to be hosting the June webinar featuring Nate Kauffman and the Live Edge Adaptation Project, LEAP. Nate is a landscape architecture educator, a consultant, a designer, and a planner based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's also the project director at Owlized, a tech startup focused on delivering to the public a greater awareness of an agency in their environments. And if you want to check out Owlized on the web, that's interesting too. They've done a very cool project in Marin, and now it's going to come to San Francisco and San Mateo, using those owl viewers that you see at tourist spots to help people see how things are going to change with sea level rise in the areas in which they live. Nate's won a number of awards and been featured in international events and published in various journals, and he's very interested in the ways that social and environmental justice challenges might be reimagined as opportunities here in the Bay Area in the face of our rapidly changing world. Here's the format. Nate is going to take his long and wonderful talk that he does for in-person audiences and condense it down to no more than 30 minutes, really in two parts here. The first, context and background, really how we got here in San Francisco Bay, and kind of go quickly through that. And then the main event to present the LEAP vision for the 21st century Bay Area. And so that'll be the first 30 minutes, and then we will do Q&A with you. You can type your questions in the box, and we can take them with Nate, and we'll have discussion and Q&A for the second 30 minutes. So with that, let me unmute Nate. I think he's unmuted, and let me move the controls over to Mr. Nate Kauffman. Hold on just a second. And Nate, you should be unmuted, are you?
Yeah, I think I am.
Good, and you have the controls and you can put your screen on now.
Okay, is that showing up for you?
That's beautiful. Thank you. And Nate, it's all yours, and we have about 50 people today signed up for the webinar from all over the Bay Area. Some are sea level rise experts, some are new to the subject, so Nate, please take it away.
Sure, okay, thanks. Well, 13 out of 50 ain't too bad. So let's see. First, I guess the first order of business is just to thank Climate Readiness Institute for hosting today. I think, needless to say, I'm really excited about the work they're doing and how they're sort of scaling up and expanding. I think they're filling a really, really important void and satisfying a terribly important role in this whole conversation. So just very briefly, this is sort of how I come at it. I've got a master's in landscape architecture, and specifically my research is looking at coastal geomorphology and how that interfaces with sort of infrastructure systems, both in the built environment and then also trying to sort of imagine landscape level natural systems as potential green infrastructures that might have multiple benefits built into them. So quick housekeeping, Measure AA on the ballot, $12 parcel tax, which is sort of a multi-decade transgenerational, in that sense, funding stream that's going to put a lot of money into our sort of shoreline resilience and adaptation and restoration projects underway. If you have not yet voted, I would strongly urge you to consider voting yes for that. And if you have voted, I hope you did. Another note is that there is an experimental workshop happening in June, actually just coming up here in a couple of weeks, and that's going to be hosted by UC Berkeley. The Dredge Fest, the Dredge Research Collaborative has done a Dredge Fest the last 3 years in the Great Lakes, Jamaica Bay in New York, and down in the Gulf. So they have finally come to California, to the Bay Area, and my friend and colleague Brett Milligan, who's a teacher up at Davis, is going to be sort of quarterbacking this event. Again, it's an experimental workshop looking at what dredging is, what it means, how we do it, why we do it, considering sediment essentially as kind of the foundation of a base infrastructure for various purposes, certainly including a lot of these adaptation measures. So again, if you're interested, look these guys up. It's coming here soon. And then finally, I would just like to say, you know, for a while there, for some reason, Bruce and I screwed something up, and I was not on CRI's mailing list, their newsletter, and we fixed that recently, and my life has been better for it. So if you're not on CRI's newsletter, I would strongly encourage you to write Bruce and get on it. In thinking about what LEAP is, people are always, you know, curious about what this is intended to do, what it means, and why. I think it's probably important to kind of go about that in the subtractive sense and just state what it is not. I don't have a roadmap for the governance challenges ahead of us. So LEAP is not intended to solve that particular part of the problem. This also isn't a planning fix per se that can be applied to different places regardless of their conditions. Similarly, this isn't a design prescription. It will not work everywhere in the same way. The question here is, what are the sort of values and threads that we can draw out of this concept to think about making the Bayshore better and the people's lives to interact with it. And I often talk about LEAP, and one of my mentors, Christina Hill, stopped me and said, you know, you're talking about this like it's a thing. It's a thing people invest in, a thing people you know, use and value, but what you're really talking about here is a way, a different sort of way of being, maybe a way of living, way of looking at and using the bay. The live edge is a concept that actually goes back to furniture making. This is a guy named George Nakashima. He's probably considered the most influential woodworker of the 20th century. And what you see here is this huge black walnut, what he called a peace altar that he built. And the perimeter of the table on these sides here, that's a live edge. It's not milled by a tool or a machine. He has let the sort of organism that is the tree define that perimeter. And he talked about this in some, I think, interesting and deep way. And he's called the live edge not just a creative force, but a moral idea. And it's basically the concept that, you know, embracing the natural within the built is really essential of deep harmony. When we're contemplating as you know, people in my profession, we're contemplating sort of the natural and the built and how they interact. We're often thinking about the ways they collide. So this is the Mississippi meander belt, which was mapped by a guy named Harold Fisk back in the 40s. This white ribbon here that's kind of billowing down is probably the Mississippi meander that he actually boated down to do this survey. And each of these successive layers, color-coded underneath, is the meander of the river at a different point in time. And you can see in this one image just the dominion and, you know, the beauty of sort of a natural system, but you can also kind of read between the lines, as it were, and see that, you know, building anything anywhere in this colored area is a challenge. And we're thinking about that in the Bay Area all the time, right? The way we reconcile the land and the water, that live edge, and the tension between those forces is often just by building land that solves that problem, right? So our levees, our dikes and revetments, seawalls, you know, that's at Ocean Beach. And this is certainly the exception, not the rule, but these things fail. That's the Jones Tract breach from a few years ago up in the Delta. That cost $90 million in damage. Of course, Katrina not only was horrifically expensive, but also had a huge human toll. And the Tohoku disaster in Japan from just a few years ago was in the fatalities and the cost to the society even worse. So that's, a levee and a seawall failing. The Bay Area is not only an amazing place to live and to study, but it's really an exemplary example of an incredible intersection between the built and the natural environments. And what we're looking at these days is about 1,000 linear miles of shoreline, depending on how you measure it, that really encircle the bay and define that edge. All of that is going to change as the water rises. How we adapt our institutions, our assets, and our infrastructure to deal with that, I think, is not only going to say a lot about our society, but it's going to pose some huge logistical hurdles for us to grapple with. And it's already happening. This was my walk to work when I was working in San Francisco. And, this wasn't an astronomical high tide. It was a very high tide on kind of a blustery day. But we're already seeing that the way in which we built, assuming the maximum elevation of a static bay, really is not cut out to deal with the reality of a very dynamic and rising bay. So if this is how we have traditionally built and reconciled that tension, this is how nature does it, with mangrove swamps, with barrier islands, with coral reefs. The important thing to understand about these systems, whether they're organisms or landscapes or entire ecosystems, is that they do not exist to valiantly throw themselves out in front of destructive wave energy or flooding. They exist because of the intersection of those forces that we so often think of in an antagonistic vein when it comes to the built environment. Here's a shot taken by my friend and colleague Mark Holmes with the Bay Institute up in Petaluma. And this is an extensive marsh plain that we now value greatly for the various benefits that it can deliver to our society, both in terms of the ecologic, in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of flood prevention, which is an extremely key piece of this. This marsh plain out here has an enormous surface area because of all of the grasses that are actually growing in it. And that surface area equals an extremely high roughness coefficient. So when water flows over this, not only is it soaking up, but it is slowing down enormously as it moves. But to prospectors back in 1850, this was a swamp. This was just an impediment to getting from the bay to the land. And it was also the low-hanging fruit in the development of much of the bay shore. So this is what it looked like pre-gold rush. Our tidal marshes ringing the bay. And they were decimated, utterly. The reason is that they were low and they were flat. So again, they were sort of this low-hanging fruit. We could fill them in for agriculture. We could fill them in for industrial purposes like building salt ponds in the South Bay, or you could fill them in simply to build high ground to build houses on. And one of the keys is also that you didn't even need to build them up. If you simply diked them off from the bay, you would end up with sort of this dry, dead parcel. So micro history lesson, and kind of swing through these. These guys are looking for gold. They are blasting the Sierra foothills with high-powered water jets and washing all of the fine sediments out and downstream. The gold in there is dropping out in traps that they have. So we've got this huge pulse of sediment that trickled down through our extensive watershed and terminated, in fact, in the bay. At the same time, we were building and deploying dams, which were further disrupting not only the ecologic, but the sediment and hydraulic cycling in the state. And we were filling in the bay, just abjectly. Here's the bridge, here's San Francisco, and these piles out here essentially define a cage in which we are dumping rubble. The rubble from the 1906 earthquake and fire, for instance, basically went in the bay. And that formed the substrate, the base layer of the new ground, in air quotes, that we could then develop on. And as Bruce and I were talking about this, he pointed out that as a kid in the Bay Area, you took your household trash, you backed the truck up, or the station wagon, and you threw that out there. You just threw it out there, it got bulldozed, got maybe capped with some dirt, and that's how we built land. The Reber Plan of sort of the 1940s was one of these massive civil works projects intended to sort of tame nature and create a landscape that was I think reminiscent of the values of the time. All of this red here is filled in. And this is a causeway cutting off the North Bay. This is a causeway cutting off the South Bay. Those were intended to eventually become essentially freshwater lakes. This would remain the heart of the shipping. This was a lock the size of the Panama Canal. This was taken seriously. I mean, this plan was not only endorsed by the San Francisco Chronicle, it was also the impetus for building the Bay model, which now resides in Marin. The Bay model proved this wouldn't work. But I think it's interesting to look at this and talk about, how far we've come. Now, out of a rejection, essentially, for this bleak future of the Bay, the forerunners of Save the Bay put together a grassroots coalition of citizens who opposed filling in the Bay. They did that, it's important to know, for aesthetic reasons mainly. And they weren't shy about that. The Bay smelled horrible and the Bay looked horrible. And they thought that intervening and stopping the filling of the Bay was important for those reasons. Now, out of the Save the Bay effort, in fact, let me just say, I think that they really did save the Bay. I mean, the future that we were pondering with plans like the Rebirth plan there would have been an absolute disaster. But because of the Save the Bay efforts and eventually the formation of the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC, and its Magna Carta, which was called the Bay Plan, we sort of froze the Bay shore. We said, okay, we're not going to fill anymore, and this new line, this new shoreline is sacrosanct. So you can't basically do things in the Bay at that edge. And we sort of petrified. We got frozen in time, and this is the Bay shore of today. Chimneys, concrete, rat's nests of rebar, entire beaches that are just made out of trash. And this entire shoreline is changing. So I think that sea level rise and climate change in general has really presented us with a question about what the Bay shore should be, because accepting that this is what it is really is not an option anymore. If it remains there as the Bay comes up, we are going to have enormous problems. You don't need to be an environmentalist to care about this. These are the metering lights to the Bay Bridge. Almost 300,000 people a day drive over the $6.4 billion new span of the Bay Bridge. And this is not upland flooding water. This is the Bay. Okay, this is just the Bay on a high tide. Some people are projecting that the water will come up a foot. Some people think it'll come up 5 feet by 2100. Either way, this freeway doesn't work anymore. The approach to that bridge is obsolete. It's not just, ooh, that's not a very good quality picture. I apologize for that. But it's not just, the transportation infrastructure. We use the flat, low Bay shore as the pallet into which we laced a lot of our infrastructure, energy infrastructure, waste and drinking water. These are all sort of housed along that flat, low Bay shore, which assumed this, again, static level, and we know that that's changing. In the aftermath of Katrina, this guy named Mario Tama took a lot of really interesting, provocative pictures, and this is one of them. This is an infrastructure that is working, right? This is a levee wall holding back the water. We have no idea what's going on the other side of this wall, and I think the important thing is neither does this lady. This wall is doing one thing, and that thing, as we already established, is something that it can fail at. So asking how our infrastructures can really be multifunctional and multi-beneficial and sort of co-generational of benefits is what my research is really all about. So today we're going to be talking about the Bay shore, but what we're really talking about are the Baylands. And that's essentially the reach between the furthest out low tide level, way out here, these mud flats, all the way up through the tidal marsh into kind of our wet meadows, and that sort of continuous band of ecosystems. Those are the Baylands, and that's what we're talking about today. We've done work to restore huge parcels of the Bay, and we've made a lot of progress in our traditional restoration projects in breaching levees, bringing water and ecosystems and organisms and sediment and organic matter back into those places. And Chris Benton, who's the author of Saltscapes, does amazing aerial photography using a kite, actually. And here you can see, I think this is 2010 through the end of 2012. And this is a dead marsh plain coming back to life after being breached. So this is working for us. But the point is that the water is coming up fast. And we're losing places all over the globe, in fact, to this rising water. These guys are performing a Shinto ceremony at Lake Suwa in Japan, and they've been keeping records there for 700 years. So we're getting glimpses into some of the ways that the climate is truly changing that go way, way back. This is actually one of CRI's, on CRI's last newsletter, an article that I got. Okay, so marsh plains grow and they move, and in fact they migrate in times of sea rise and sea recession. So when the ice caps formed and the oceans receded, the marsh plains traveled with them. Now, one of the problems we have here is that they don't have a lot of places to migrate to as the bay comes up. And we're talking about a second decimation. If we get this level of sea level rise, which is 4 feet, basically by 2100, we're talking about losing almost 96% of our marshes in the Bay Area if we don't do something. So the Baygoo report this year concluded that most of our marshes are in fact going to be damaged and destroyed for that time period. My graduate thesis was all about this question, and what I discovered was that marshes grow in places where wind and waves are not a destructive force. So shore forms, generally more robust ones like beaches and barrier islands, etc., or breakwaters built by people that sort of shadow these marsh plains, really give them a toehold to get going and to grow and evolve. And it's possible to construct those. You don't have to wait for the natural cycles to create them. You can actually go and build them. So in the LEAP research and development, these are generalizations, but this is really what I believe at this point. The dredging regimen in the San Francisco Bay is wasteful. We are wasting material every single year that we could be using to perform these functions of building and buffering these marshes, and that our regulatory and permitting frameworks are really struggling to figure out how to design and develop and deploy projects that are going to move us forward. Now we have a talk of a big competition this year intended to do that, and I think BCDC just took a unanimous vote declaring their intent to absolutely move in these directions. So Deborah Godin, who I think is on the call today, corrected some data that I had seen in the BCDC graph. I didn't actually make this graph. This was published by BCDC. But this is these are a sand mining vessel and a clamshell barge in Marin, and they're collecting dredge materials to basically keep waterways open for container ships, ferries, and private boats and waterways. And what we're doing essentially is taking, in the last year in 2015, we took about 2 or 3 million cubic yards of material. There's a Trans-American pyramid, it's 850 feet tall. That extruded cube is the approximate volume of material. We took that and we dumped it in the Pacific Ocean. So we took it from a place that we didn't want it, and we put it in a place where we couldn't use it. I think that we need to start rethinking kind of the discrepancy between cost and value on that front. However, the bottom line is we need an enormous quantity of sediment and of material to buffer and build these marsh plains up and help them keep pace with the rising bay. That's basically the focus of Dredge Fest. So again, if you want to check that out and tune in, great. As for the policy and regulatory framework that I think is outmoded, this is down at the Orloma Sanitary District. They're testing the horizontal levee, which we'll talk quite a bit about today. This is a very small, modest, disconnected from the bay proof of concept pilot project. And here it is. You can see this isn't a gigantic parcel. This took about 6 months to build. It took over 4 years to permit this. If that's the rate at which we are really testing progressive projects, we have a really steep hill coming at us very, very fast. LEAP is an attempt to sort of reconcile those realities with a broader question about what our society and what the Bay Area, the region of the Bay Area, intends to invest in for future generations. And I think to do that, we need to recognize the intersections of the different sort of utilities that come along with decisions that we make for protecting our societies, for protecting our landscapes, for protecting our infrastructures. So there's an ecologic utility that we now value, very, very in a heartfelt way. And there's a cultural utility that we think the Bay should play. It's why we live here in the first place. And an economic utility. I don't mean that purely in the sense of money in fiscal terms. Economics is about resources and how we use them and the decisions we make about the use of them. If you start thinking about the conceptual ties between these utility functions, you discover sort of the second valence, another shell of the ways in which we might think about using and valuing the San Francisco Bay. And then to contemplate the functionality of that conceptual level leads you to this sort of third valence, in which the specifics of how these different operations can work together can be not mutually exclusive, but can be complementary and be tied into a larger network moving forward to make things happen in the Bay. So let's take the East Bay. Bruce and I are in the East Bay. Let's look at the East Bay. This green area here is a very, very shallow offshore terrace area. This is a lot of, several hundred acres offshore, a couple of thousand acres offshore of the East Bay. So here's the Emeryville Crescent here. Here's the Bay Bridge, Treasure Island, Brooks Island, Richmond, Berkeley. If we considered that this area, which is going to become flooded, essentially, it's going to become open water with a rising bay, not mudflats anymore, open water, which is the most dangerous landscape next to which a society can really live. If we considered that this was an opportunity for marsh plain building, then we could also think about ways that offshore novel landforms, like sandbars and spits, like small barrier islands that are either accessible or maybe are nature preserves, that shoals and underwater sandbars and reefs, whether those are oyster reefs or rock reefs, artificial reefs, they can create that wave break to then buy us these kind of nurseries for the nascent marsh plains to develop and grow. We're going to have to help them get there, but if we get them started, we may be able to keep them going to help keep pace with the rising bay. So this is just a conceptual framework of all the different ways that these novel landscape systems might be grafted on to the kind of urban scaffold, all of which, by the way, at the Bayshore in the East Bay, is artificial anyway. This is all fill. This is all garbage, and there are some nasty toxic sites in there. So we have a vested interest in protecting those places in addition to the infrastructure vulnerabilities. Zooming out and thinking about this on a larger regional scale, so instead of site-specific or sub-regional, but contemplating a network of how these places might work together around the bay, of open space, of these pedestrian and biking infrastructures, of off-limits habitat preserves, essentially, we can look at it on that level. And then zooming in, the framework is very simple. We have waves that are coming towards shore that are destructive, not just for our current shoreline, but for potential marsh plain establishment and evolution. If you build an offshore landform, you can sap the energy out of those waves. And you can create this protected area in which, sort of this lagoon, in which marsh plains can be seeded and can be encouraged to grow and evolve. And again, those are going to deliver that flood protection that you need. But for the physical barrier that actually keeps salt water out of the upland, the horizontal levee is intended to fill that purpose. It's a basically very low tech sediment base infrastructure. It's just a different type of levee that's holding that water back. But as you can see, it's not riprap on 2-to-1 sides. It's got a big ecotone on the shoreward side. Here's how that is supposed to work. And again, this isn't a prescription for a place. This is just a conceptual diagram. That white polygon you see down here in the corner, that's about the profile of our current bayside barriers in many places. It's steep on the sides, doesn't really have any ecologic value. In fact, is a barrier between ecosystems. Flat on top, so you can drive down it or walk down it. And it's very thin. So you can see it didn't take a lot of material to actually build that. The horizontal levee is a system that uses a much longer, much more material to create a longer, shallower slope, this apron of land extending out into the baylands. It's all intended to hold back the salt water, obviously, to keep the bay from coming up into the upland. but it's doing more than that. So if we examine this sort of piece of the horizontal levee in greater detail, we can see the different ways that other systems are tied into it. Stormwater coming down from the upland is going to treat the horizontal levee as a barrier, just as saltwater coming in from the bay is going to see it as a barrier. What you do with that, whether you detain it, whether you put that through canals or into detention ponds, or you pump it, is a question that we're obviously going to need to be thinking about. Wastewater. This is a really key and interesting piece of the horizontal levee. The horizontal levee takes polished wastewater. So when you flush your toilet in San Francisco, you're sending a couple gallons of the finest drinking water on Earth down to the sewage treatment plant, which gets treated and then blasted out into the middle of the bay or the middle of the ocean. The horizontal levee intends to capture that water and then send it to the crest after polishing it of the levee, where it will trickle down and sort of permeate back into the soil. So it's an engine. Runoff and urban drool coming down, again, we need to figure out where that goes and how we get it there. But when we have that treated wastewater charging the slope and irrigating, you're going to get vegetation. The vegetation will produce organic material. That organic material will eventually get swept down into the marsh plain down here. And again, it's a physical barrier to keep the waters of the bay back. You can't do it everywhere, but there are sort of lessons built into that. Down in Eden Landing, John Bourgeois with the Coastal Conservancy has been doing some really interesting work, traditional restoration. He's interested in how these progressive projects can actually be tied in to enhance our traditional, currently underway projects that we have going on now. The Oraloma Sanitary District, where they are testing the horizontal levee currently, is a pretty amazing place, honestly. And Jason Warner there, who's their head engineer, is a very cool guy. It's a great project. We've got a lot of infrastructure and assets to protect that are technically going to be in the floodplain as we move forward. And what the horizontal levee, which is just sort of this scallop light green band on the back of these cells of marshplain, does is, again, it's the physical infrastructure to hold the water back. But we're looking at this on a much broader level. So reconnecting our freshwater tributaries, our canals, our streams, etc., to the bay to get them cycling sediment offshore is one key to this. The Oraloma Sanitary District, the sewage treatment plant, they capture the methane produced on site. They have a solar array. It's a pretty amazing place. So it's sort of this holistic view of how we can manage the shoreline in better ways. Expanding the floodplain so we have more capacity. Thinking about bringing people down there so they actually value these places. Strengthening or enhancing the shore form to be flood protection, or to enhance our flood protection as well. And this is a landfill. Again, we really need to think about what we're going to do with these vestigial pieces of the bay shore that are going to be affected and changed by a rising bay. So this is the Emeryville Crescent. We were looking at a picture at the beginning of this of the metering lights. There's the toll booth. This is going out to Treasure Island. Here's downtown Oakland, Lake Merritt, Interstate 80. This is called the Emeryville Crescent. And I have added this extensive marsh plain in here, which most of you will know is added, but currently ringing this embayment, which actually is underperforming for us in multiple ways. Nobody recreates in there because it is so shallow. There is about 90 acres of sort of green space ringing the Emeryville Crescent. If we thought about building a barrier at the mouth of it, and this is sort of what we call in landscapes a tombolo system, these sort of points that stick out with the bay between them. If we think about building a barrier there to shadow this marsh plain, we could contemplate filling this in with dredge material or other sediments to incorporate and encourage that this would form, and then recognizing that with that landscape actually grafted onto the urban scaffold, all of this sort of light blue surrounding here is flooding that could be mitigated. So going in there and building basically an ecosystem can remove huge impacts on not only the port, our sewage treatment plant down here, Interstate 80, places people live. I mean, that's what this is really all about, trying to protect the upland by this sort of green fill method. And I don't say that in a glib way. I understand that these are ecosystems composed of living things that are linked together and closely connected, and also that we've inherited through the legacy of the bay and some of the less sort of responsible management decisions we've made in the past and industrialization. We've inherited a lot of problems, including pollution, that go with it. And in the long view, thinking about this on a broader scale, the marsh plane is an extremely effective carbon sequestration complex in shore form. So imagining this working for sort of future generations and on a broader spatial scale also. We have industry like Chevron that's at risk of flooding. We have the infrastructure of East Bay transportation infrastructure we discussed. We have the SFO and the Oakland International Airports that are so low and flat and are subsiding even as the bay is rising. And they can't build walls around them because the planes can't get over those walls. So how you might contemplate using sort of these green infrastructure solutions to help with that is something I'm interested in. This was from a competition for the Berkeley Global Campus in Richmond. So we are basically in looking sort of southwest here. Here's the Albany Bulb. Here's Point Isabel. This is 580 running out to the bridge. We're hovering over sort of the Iron Triangle. This is called the Marina Bay district in Richmond, and the Berkeley Global Campus is going to be developed. So we're not just talking about a bay shore where retreating and realigning is feasible everywhere. I mean, these are places worth a lot of money that are going to turn into developed land. So thinking about ways that we can protect those and enhance those and share the responsibility and sort of discover the common skin in the game to do so is what LEAP is interested in. And it may take many different forms. Again, this isn't a prescription for what it looks like or how it works. A barrier island or a spit, they're doing the same thing, but really becoming valuable to the people that live there so that they can share this experience, use these as pedestrian and biking infrastructures, overlooks, accessible beaches potentially, off-limits preserves, getting oysters back in the bay, even if they're grafted onto sort of artificial modules that give them a chance to get established. They're cleaning water all the time, and they can function as these sort of breakwater reefs, turning sort of those vestigial cells of the bay that we've lost back into functional marsh plains. And again, you know, nature preserves. The Pacific Flyway has been severely impacted by the decimation of the marsh plains, and it's going to be even more impacted by the second decimation because we're going to lose so many of these. But if we start building these ecosystems again, we'll see a return and an expansion of a lot of that. What if the bay was somewhere you wanted to go and spend time at night? It isn't, you know, it is not currently. I'd like to imagine there's a possibility for that. And again, just sort of all of the different ways that these recreational, cultural, societal uses can potentially function with the ecologic and the flood protection that some of these landscapes can offer us and give us. In the South Bay, you know, I really think that there are leaders in innovation down there, and one of the ironies is that though they live on and in the bay, we're way behind on this, on the project or on the sort of endeavor of adapting the bay shore for the rising waters. So I would like to think that we can take innovation out of the smartphone and think about how that interfaces with the live edge. So sorry I went a little over time. I think we got started a couple minutes late, but that's the overview of LEAP.
Great, thank you very much, Nate. We are applauding in our offices. So let's open it up for questions now. And so we have the first question from Steve Kinsey. And you can type your question in the chat function, and then I'll relay them here to Nate. Steve is asking, what special consideration needs to be given to sites that were historically used as landfills when we're adapting shorelines? And does opening them to tidal action have special risks, and are they well mapped?
Okay, well, thanks, Steve. Let me work backwards. They're relatively well mapped in terms of where they are. They are not all that well mapped in terms of what went into the landfill. So there's a question of what is there and you know what lies beneath, if you will. So there are successive layers at the Berkeley Marina, for example, which is completely artificial. This entire thing, that's all junk. And what you would do is you'd pull out there, you'd unload your truck. This is like Bruce was talking about doing this with his dad back in the day. And then at the end of the day, they would lay down dirt and bulldoze it all. So there's sort of this sandwich going way, way, way down. There are possibilities for methane harvest out there. There are possibilities to chew that material up. What you don't want to do is open it up to tidal action, apropos your question here, if you don't know what's in there. And frankly, even in the places that we do know what's in there, that's not good stuff to have getting out into the bay. So the LEAP sort of approach is actually about going outboard of the shore to try to keep the water away from that. Now, you are going to have an expanding groundwater halo as the sea comes up. That's going to want to infiltrate into those places. I think remediation of those sites is yet another sort of endlessly fascinating and simultaneously daunting chapter in this whole saga. But yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's a
great.
That's
thanks, thank you, and thanks, Steve, for the question. Doug Walls has the next one. What's the latest on methane emissions from marshlands that we've created, counteracting actually carbon sequestration benefits? Do you have math on that, Nate?
I don't have math on that. I've done a little bit of reading about it. My impression was that since we haven't been actually building marsh plains so much as letting them reestablish in places that they have not been, but historically were. Again, not to get into the specifics, but my impression was that the math that I've seen is that the net carbon sequestration is higher than GGH going out.
Great, thank you. Next question, how does a sediment balance play out for this vision? It seems like we would need much more than is currently being dredged, and what lack of sediment would the marsh accretion be able to keep up with sea level rise?
Yeah, okay, well that's the elephant, right? And we are not, yeah, great question. We are not dredging enough to do this on the scale of what we're looking at the screen here, which again is like here's the big move. We know this isn't going to happen. There's also the problem of the infrastructure to store, to move, and to deliver those sediments. You know, you don't want to be driving a D8 mover out into the middle of a marsh plain and dumping a heap of dirt. You need to be thoughtful and careful and methodical about how we are nourishing them. There was sort of a second piece of that question, the sediment balance. So this huge pulse of sediment that came down the bay from hydraulic mining of the gold rush is tapped out. And all those fines came in and settled out, and some of it blew out the bay, and again, we've been dredging some of it. But if you look at maps of the North Bay, for example, there's several feet of very, very, very fine sediment sitting on top of very polluted ones. So we can't just go in there and sort of like vacuum all that material out. I think that even though ideally we're getting this material from sort of the benthic environment, there are other ways to imagine where we're building levees, for example, using upland material to do that. Again, you're going to need to figure out what the implication of that is, right? So if you dig in the upland, you're creating a low point that water is going to want to pond. That may not be a bad thing. And in fact, many places in the Netherlands have models and similar approaches and applications that address that, and I think very elegant, graceful, and compelling ways. The Dutch also have created a landscape infrastructure called the Zandmotor, or the sand engine, and that's in the North Sea. And what they did was they basically raked up, I think, 63 million cubic yards of sand from offshore, piled it in one spot, understanding that winds and waves and the longshore current would redistribute this all over their shoreline and buffer and nourish those beaches. I think that's something to think about also.
Great. Next question. These are excellent questions, gang. Keep them coming here on the chat function. Next one, will protecting one section of the bay shore, say with the LEAP type approach, adversely affect an unprotected section? This kind of gets to Mark Stacey's research.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, who's that from, Bruce?
From Michael Morrison.
Okay, well, so Michael, first of all, Bruce and CRI is invested in a really interesting project right now, led by an environmental engineer at UC Berkeley named Mark Stacey. And what he is doing is creating a model for being able to assess how doing something here affects something here, or affects something, you know, all the way over here. The short answer, I would say, is that with natural type shore forms, adverse effects further downstream to other natural type shore forms are not that big of an issue, or at least can be balanced and calculated. But this is driving kind of the whole conversation in the context of why we don't build seawalls as readily anymore. The seawall was increasing scouring, it was increasing sediment transport, it was increasing turbulence, and that was affecting surrounding areas. The landscape infrastructure doesn't have the same kind of problem because it really is all about the balance between the water and the land and the organisms that manage and regulate them.
Great, thank you. And we'll have much more from Mark Stacey's research later this year. It's a multi-year project, but later this year we'll have initial ability with a new model to be able to look, as Nate said, at what if city A takes action A, what happens to cities B and C on either side or across the bay. Next question, should these projects be prioritized by when sea level rise will impact an area? For example, Bay Bridge Toll area may need to be mitigated in 2030 before an area somewhere else. Should a timeline, do you think, be created? That's from Donald Price.
Okay, Donald, yeah, great question. And I think we think, you know, in the broader circle, the answer is yes. We need to do basically a suitability analysis and a risk assessment function for these various places to figure out where you get started. One of the sort of overarching challenges there is that ecosystems are not born or built overnight. They take years, if not decades, if not centuries, to be established. Now, I think we have some of the technology to approach this in a way that we can actually jumpstart them and get them rolling and kind of accelerate that that formation and that establishment. But I think that, yeah, the answer to your question is we absolutely need to be thinking about the most critical places. And frankly, those are spots that are going to benefit from these progressive proof of concept projects that I think are really important for us to be investing in now.
Great, thank you. Next question from Shiva Berman. What's the level of political and economic support at this point for LEAP, and what will the passing of Measure AA on Tuesday make possible for you?
Knock on wood. Yeah, Shiva. So political, it's tough. I think that we, in the abstract, really like the idea of a living, live, green, multifunctional bayshore. And at the end of the day, my sense is that many politicians are simply intimidated by, and I know that we have some politicians on the phone today, don't be offended, I think they're intimidated by trying to get blood from a stone. I mean, these are expensive operations, and the San Francisco Bay Area, I think in 2010 we got $500,000 in federal money for adaptation measures in the San Francisco Bay. In that same year, the Chesapeake got $30 million to $500,000. That's because they have 12 senators fighting for the Chesapeake, and we have 2 for the entire state of California. So I think going federal is to get money and to really put these projects into practice is absolutely what should happen. I'm not exactly sure what the machinery for that looks like, but I think that's, you know, insofar as there might be an answer, I think that's getting near it.
Thank you, Nate. And our next question comes from one of our best local elected officials, Dave Pine, on sea level rise issues. And Dave asks, since we have so few opportunities for wetlands to migrate inland, is it correct to conclude that the LEAP model is highly dependent to building wave breaks and barriers, while restoration efforts to date have not constructed such wave breaks and barriers?
Yes. Well, yeah. Thanks, Dave. Or Mr. Pine, Supervisor Pine. The problem with building those barriers, again, was that they were fill, and that was considered fill, and that was considered anathema to place material in the bay and establish those breakwaters. There are places, I mean, you will notice in your backyard that in the Embarcadero region of San Francisco, we have a really difficult problem to contemplate here. We not only have a low elevation, we have a submerged combined sewer stormwater basically catchment pipe beneath the Embarcadero, and we have a deep offshore environment. So thinking about ways that you put material out there, not to mention the energy that sweeps through the gate here, contemplating ways that you put material out there, that's going to be really tricky in some spots. But I mean, your assumption is correct that the reason we haven't gone out is that is that this is still considered, believe it or not, this is, by the letter of the law, this is still considered fill in the bay.
The next question comes from William Carney. What is the nexus of these climate adaptation strategies to climate mitigation, to actual GHG reduction? What's the temperature in degrees beyond which these efforts become futile? Can we set a precedent to match every dollar spent on adaptation with a dollar invested in reducing GHG? So have at it, Nate.
Great question. And I think that, at the level that this is going to be sold, if you will, federally to get that kind of money flowing, that's exactly the kind of metric and methodology that will need to be introduced to track this, to prove that it's working, and to say, we can talk about time in sea level rise, but we can also talk about just the level of sea level rise. We don't actually know exactly what's going to happen or exactly when. Unfortunately, it looks like in the sort of later mid-century, there's sort of this hockey stick. It's an inflection point at which the rise in the bay is going to outstrip, at the rate that it rises, the rate that our marsh plains can grow, which is why going in and proving, for example, per acre or per parcel or per site, what they're doing for, I think, the global system, as well as the sort of site, local, regional community that surrounds it. I think being able to come up with those numbers is absolutely crucial, absolutely key. I don't think anything will happen, frankly, unless you have that, a method for doing that.
And just to add, our CRI mission and vision is, while we're focused on adaptation and resilience, hand in hand with that, as your question implies, we have to be doing much more around GHG reduction, or eventually you can't adapt and you can't become resilient. So we think the two are go hand in hand. And in fact, in the planning that's going on at the state level now in California, and planning at least at the federal level, mitigation or GHG reduction and adaptation are now not considered in two different meetings, which is a step that we're talking about them in the 6 pillars that the governor now has in California for climate work. One of those now is climate adaptation, along with the GHG reduction. So a related question it looks like we are ultimately heading towards something like 4 or 5 or 6 meters or more of sea level rise. How does LEAP anticipate this future?
Yeah, well, gosh, that's kind of maybe the sad fact of it. I'm not an optimist by nature. I think Kyoto didn't do what it needed to, and Paris, I think, is the same thing. If the sea is going to come up 4, 5, or 6 meters, you are talking about a remaking of most of the societies on Earth. LEAP may be an effort to buy time to figure out what to do about that. And it may buy significant time. It may buy us into the next century. But if the sea does come up 4, 5, or 6 meters, if the Greenland ice sheet cleaves off, that's game over for every shoreline society, basically, on the planet.
And again, that gets back to our last question about we can't just be talking about adaptation. We have to be talking about a significant and substantial amount, way over what we're doing right now, of reducing GHGs as we go ahead in the next couple of decades. So a couple more. We have a few more minutes. What is urban drool, was a question here.
Yeah, great. Yeah, good one. Urban drool, so like people are constantly watering their lawns when they shouldn't be. Things are leaking, pipes are leaking. There is sort of this trickle down of water that we never really see, that's constantly pulling not only off the upland, but is actually moving and motivating some sediment to go with it. And so if you built a perfect impermeable barrier at the bayshore, even if you didn't have rain and storms, you would see water collecting on the landward side of that. And that's what urban drool really is. It's kind of this slow minor seep of wasted water coming down off the upland.
So last question, Nate, and this has been very, very informative and helpful to all of us. How do you see getting LEAP from a vision that it is, as you said, not a prescription or a plan, but how do you see taking it from a vision to actual pilot projects, to an eventual plan? What's your vision for the vision here?
Well, I'm trying I'm trying through teaching, through Owlized, and sort of through doing events like this to find the people around the Bay, the power players, the folks from outside of these institutions who have means, who have leverage, who have connections, who know people, who want to see this as the future for their kids and their grandkids. We talk about 2100 all the time in the abstract because we're all going to be dead. But my friends who are having kids these days, I mean, my sister's 6 months pregnant right now, her son or daughter is going to be 85 or 84 in 2100. So that's a real thing, you know, and to answer the question, I think we need to be building private and public partnerships from the large, very profitable, committed to innovation institutions all over the Bay, and then I think that those need to have an avenue to move forward. So an interface with all of the different regulatory groups. There's a great long article by John King just a week ago about all the overlapping and different sort of organizational architectures that have to clear and support and basically tacitly endorse any project that's going to be done in, on, or around the Bayshore. I think we need to find a way to start, frankly, streamlining that process and building this brain trust of young people that want to get involved these days, which I know something CRI is committed to, who are going to be the ones inheriting this problem, not only, you know, in their lives, but maybe professionally, and then taking those people who are politicians who want a football to run with, who are visionary, who are the big power players in the South Bay, who have means and are ostensibly committed to this ethos, right? And people who are disadvantaged. I mean, people who are in all of the, I mean, the people who are going to get nailed the worst by climate change are, guess who? The poor, underrepresented folks that live in places that are prone to flooding around the Bay. That's unethical. It's also unethical to hand this problem off to future generations. So I'm looking for those people around the Bay to stand up, and I'm willing to leverage whatever skills I have to sort of try to build some groundswell towards better, brighter future.
Great, thank you, Nate. And let's do one more bonus question related to that big one. Is there a way that the ecosystem services provided by new marshes that you would build can be monetized to attract private investment in creating new marshes? So let's finish with this one.
All right, you know what I'm going to do for this one? I'm going to show you guys a drawing in progress that no one else has seen. Conceptual, okay? We've dug out in the upland, we've piled that material into the horizontal levee over here. What this drawing will become when it is populated by all the different folks using it and all the different ways that they want to interface with this is not just about the ecosystem services per se, but about how the interface between the built and natural environment can be an economic engine for the entire region. All right, so you're going to have all of this recreation happening. There's also potential for energy, et cetera, offshore. You're going to have all of this interaction for folks, public open space, park going, et cetera. San Francisco famously makes something like $2 billion a year off of the visitation to Golden Gate Park and Crissy Fields. They generate $2 billion a year, according to Spur, in profits for the city. So imagining, look, aquaponics, aquaculture, I'm not a duck hunter, you know, that's a thing. All of the aquaculture that could be done potentially in the Bay eventually, and turning this back into a vibrant fishery. In addition to all of the sort of educational things, I think that the monetization, which sounds like a dirty word, of the live edge to work again as this economic engine is enormous, but it takes serious vision to imagine this working because it's happening on such a long time scale. You know, it's going to take us years to plan it, years to permit it, years to build it, and decades before we start really seeing those systems sort of feed back in.
Great. Thank you, Nate. And thank you all for joining us. Nate, one more time, give people your email,
Sure.
yell it out so they can reach you with further questions or that want to partner with you.
Okay. I'll give you my Berkeley email because that's probably the easiest one to remember. It's just NATE. Actually, no, I'm going to give you my owlized email because that's the easiest to remember. NATE at owlized, OWLIZED.com. NATE at owlized.com.
Great. Thank you, Nate. This has been a fabulous introduction for all of us to LEAP. We wish you good luck, and CRI will support you as you go forward. And I want to thank all of you for being with us on the CRI webinar today. I'm Bruce Reardon, the Program Director for the CRI, and thank you for joining us for this June webinar.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That means a lot.